Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that asks whether America got it badly wrong when they got more and more involved in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was a communist. He had studied communism and seen it firsthand, both in the Soviet Union and China. But he had also lived for varying periods of time in New York, London and Paris. And he was also a fierce nationalist and wanted to free his country of any foreign interference, be it French, Japanese or American. He had been impressed by President Wilson's commitment to self-determination after World War I, and by the American Declaration of Independence, which not only declared that all men were created equal, but that they should have a say in who governed them. And he knew that Vietnamese independence was not a priority in Moscow. Whereas during World War II, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh and America had actually cooperated with each other in the fight against the Japanese. And when World War II came to an end, with the Viet Minh in control of the north of the country, they declared Vietnamese independence. The Americans, who had of course themselves fought the British for the right to govern themselves, were at first sympathetic. And Ho Chi Minh, in a clever ploy, had courted their support by including extracts of the American Declaration of Independence in the Vietnamese Declaration. But the Americans also needed to bolster France in the fight against communism in Europe, and America was already thinking about the strategic importance of possible American naval bases in Vietnam. So the American position swung to supporting France in its attempt to reclaim Indochina. And when China fell to the communists, led by Mao Zedong in 1949, this support only became more urgent. As Mao started to help the Viet Minh in their fight against the French, America came to see the danger that if they didn't draw a line in the sand in Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia might fall under communist control. The fall of China and North Korea to communism, as well as what had happened in Europe, affected American thinking, and President Eisenhower saw Vietnam as a key battleground in the policy of containment and the fight against communism. Both Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, were convinced that the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union were planning to spread communism throughout Asia, just as the Soviet Union had done in Eastern Europe. Whereas in fact, the history of China and Vietnam showed that they were not necessarily going to be close allies. Ho Chi Minh would not allow Vietnam to be dominated by China. Nevertheless, if all of Vietnam was to fall to communism, Eisenhower was convinced that so too would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, today's Myanmar, Malaya, today's Malaysia, Indonesia, and possibly even India. They would fall like dominoes, the fall of one leading to the fall of the next. It was President Eisenhower who, at a press conference in April 1954, first publicly explained the domino theory. The future President Kennedy, though using a different metaphor, the finger in the dike, expressed the same theory in a speech in 1956, adding Japan and the Philippines as being in danger, and claiming that if this were to happen, America's security would be seriously threatened. However, when America finally withdrew from Vietnam, though some of the dominoes did begin to fall, Laos and Cambodia were under communist control by 1975, the Pathet Lao in Laos and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the rest of the dominoes did not fall. In 1955, America threw their support behind NGO Diem, a corrupt and unscrupulous dictator who had ousted Bao Dai, the former emperor of Vietnam. Diem was totally out of touch with the Vietnamese people. He belonged to the landlord class, which looked down on the peasantry and treated them with almost total disregard. He was also a Christian, who set him apart from the vast majority of Vietnamese, who were Buddhists. He imprisoned and executed legitimate opponents to his regime. But as far as the Americans were concerned, he had one all-important credential. He was fiercely anti-communist and would keep South Vietnam that way. Again and again, Diem showed an almost total disregard for the national religion, yet America propped up his regime. On June the 11th, 1963, Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist monk, set fire to himself in Saigon in protest at the intolerant policies of the government. As he did this, his fellow monks handed out leaflets calling for Diem's government to show charity and compassion to all religions. Another 5 monks would make the same protest, but the government only responded by increasing its persecution of their religion. Diem was also totally corrupt and was certainly no Democrat, refusing to hold elections. Instead, he appointed family members and supporters to government positions. He was eventually overthrown by the army, helped by the CIA, America having accepted that they had backed the wrong man. This was in November 1963. But the regimes that replaced him, a succession of generals, were almost as bad. And all the time, America continued to pour in millions of dollars in aid and more advisors to prop up the regimes. You might detect a pattern here. Syngman Rhee in South Korea, corrupt but fiercely anti-communist. Batista in Cuba, corrupt but ready to look after American interests. And now Diem in South Vietnam, corrupt but fiercely anti-communist. In August 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam led to a marked escalation in American involvement in Vietnam. For as much as a decade, the CIA had been assisting the South Vietnamese on sabotage missions on the North Vietnamese coast. On August the 2nd, the American destroyer SS Maddox, which had been monitoring one of these raids but was in international waters, was fired on by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The SS Maddox was unscathed. One of the patrol boats was sunk, the other 2 damaged. Then, on August the 4th, the SS Maddox reported that it had again been attacked. But to this day there is considerable doubt whether the second incident actually took place. The Maddox was patrolling in very stormy conditions. The American government was aware of the doubts over the second incident, but didn't share this with Congress or the American people. With the American election just months away, President Johnson wanted a firm response, and so he ordered American planes to bomb North Vietnamese naval bases. What is more, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave President Johnson the power, and I quote, to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression and achieve peace and security, was passed with an overwhelming majority. It was, in effect, a resolution giving the American president the power to wage war, and America would soon be at war in Vietnam. So there's an interesting perspective for you. Was the Vietnam War a huge mistake? Did America get it badly wrong? And in the spirit of explaining how we get in a mess, let me remind you about my podcast, Making Sense of This Crazy World, in which I use history to help us understand what's going on in the world today. If you find history interesting, you should find the podcast interesting. MUNers might find it useful. It's been going for more than a year now, so there's plenty of mini-series for you to dip into. Check it out if you're not into the exam season. But for me, for now, it only remains for me to thank you, as always, for listening. Cheers.